Right, off we go.
Hello, everyone.
Hiya.
Hi. So we've made it. We're at lesson 10, the final video in our Inspector Calls lesson series whilst in lockdown. So this, we've just done a lesson on the inspector's final speech, and then what we're going to be looking at in this video is after the inspector's left and what happens between the Birlings once he's gone. So today's kind of big question that we're looking at is, have the Birlings actually learned anything from the inspector's visit? So we are going to be looking at what happens to the Birlings and what they say once the inspector's left. So the inspector's left, he said his final speech, his members of one body speech, and now the Birlings are just left with his parting words. Gerald has returned at this point and has told the Birlings that the inspector was a fake and that he was an imposter. So the big things that we're looking at is, are they going to be relieved as characters that they've kind of managed to worm their way once again out of any trouble? Are they going to carry on as normal? Has anyone actually learned anything? So let's take a look and see.
So thank you, Miss Harrison. That was a lovely final introduction. I can't believe we've done 10 of these. That's how fast lockdown's gone.
Nice round number to end on 10.
Yeah, it is a really nice number. I feel pleased with that.
Yeah.
Just before Mrs. Marshall's going to take over with the first quote, we're going to focus on whether the Birlings have learned anything. And I think this theory links quite well to helping you understand the theme of learning. And so Priestley, I'm not really sure why, but he seemed to like the idea of time and theories linked around time. And so the one of the theories that he enjoyed learning about was Ouspensky's theory of time. So when I think about my understanding, it's kind of like reincarnation. So once we die, we re-enter our life from the beginning and we relive it essentially, and we relive the same events. Okay, but this cycle will repeat itself time and time and time again unless we learn something significant. So when we look at applying this theory to the Birlings, imagine they may have to relive their lives, or the same again, until they are improved spiritually as people. Okay, so if we are able to better ourselves, then Ouspensky believes that it allows us to enter a new life, and where we avoid making the same mistakes again and again. I would suggest, I mean, this is a 90s film, and again, this shows my age. Watch Groundhog Day. Kind of the same principle. Yeah, I would say. Right. So I think I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Marshall.
Yeah, I think Groundhog Day is a more like evening friendly one than Seven. You should not watch alone. Yeah, Groundhog Day is all right. It's fun. Is it?
Love Bill Murray.
Does he wake up to I Bit? Yeah. I got you, babe. Yeah. I got you, babe. That's the one.
Another song you guys need to look up.
Yeah. Well, I think episodes 9 and 10 of our online learning have gone a bit rogue, haven't they? We've got. You can tell that lockdown has really got to us. The last 9 and 10 delirium is set in. I think so. Yeah. I think so. Right. Let's look at Birling. So the quote that I've picked then, so following on from what Miss Wan has just said about the theory of them kind of being trapped in this circle and forced to repeat things unless they learn anything, that's quite important in terms of the structure of the play and how he cleverly structures it so that the Birlings are kind of tested in a way, because Gerald goes out, he comes back in, hey guys, the inspector's a fake, And one of the most telling things about whether they've learned anything or not is the way the different characters react to this. And the adverbs in the end of the play, as you get towards the end and it kind of picks up in pace, the adverbs are really interesting to look at for each of the characters. Now, remember that this is a play, so the stage directions have instructions for the actors. And so adverbs obviously meaning how the action is carried out. So it's the instruction to the actor, how should their tone of voice be? And so it's quite interesting to look at when Gerald starts to say, look, the inspector wasn't real. And then he starts to go further than that. He takes on the role of a bit of a detective himself, starting to say, hang on a second, you didn't see the photograph the same one as me. And how do we know it's the same photo? How do we know there's the same girl? How do we know there even was a girl? And he's so proud of himself with his smug little weasel face. As he's talking about it, he kind of gets carried away. Stop it. He gets carried away, and the adverbs talk about how the other characters lean in, like Mr. Birling, excitedly, and the adverb for Gerald is triumphantly, when he finally sort of decides that they should make the phone call. So I think that's a really interesting thing for you to look at, the way that if we're going to examine have they learned anything, then why would these adverbs being used, excitedly, eagerly, if they weren't learning anything? They're just loving it. They're loving the fact that they're actually finding out that they might be off the hook in some way. And it shows straight away that instantly characters like Gerald and Mr. Birling do not care at all about Eva Smith. I mean, Gerald's one reason for leaving was because he said, I'm rather more upset than this than I might appear. That's rubbish. He comes back in smug as you like. If he really was upset by it, why is he so triumphant? Why is he so excited and eager to expose the idea that the inspectors are fake? What he's really left for is because he's worried about his own reputation. So anyway, I haven't even come on to my Birling quote yet. I'm still sort of leading up to it. Sorry about this. So he, coming back to what I was saying, it's a test then. So Gerald decides to make the phone call, and they see whether there was a girl that's dead. They find out that no dead girl has been brought into the infirmary. He thinks, fantastic, I've done it. And they all start talking about how clever Gerald is and forgetting that he's a massive sleazeball. And, even Mrs. Birling talks about how clever he is, instead of, before she was talking about it being a disgusting affair. She doesn't care about that anymore. She's just, oh, you're so clever, Gerald. So this is a real test. And he sets them up very cleverly in the play, because he forces them to reveal their true feelings about it. And then, of course, he plays it back on them by having the second phone, the other phone call at the end, which we'll come on to later. So my quote that I've chosen is really about Birling's failure of the test, really. The test is, do you really care about what you did or not? And if he did, he wouldn't react the way he does. So Birling gets quite annoyed with Sheila and Eric, because they sort of, well, in some respects, pass the test. I'll come on to that a little bit later. But they at least show that they care more about what's happened to Eva, as Miss Harrison will discuss a little bit later, because she's going to look at Sheila. Is that right, Miss Harrison? Is yours a Sheila quote?
A Sheila quote.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, yours is a Sheila one, isn't it? So
yes.
Because Sheila and Eric sort of still seem very upset, and they think, well, nothing's changed. This is very different to Birling. So Birling gets quite annoyed with them. He says, well, my dear, they're just so damned exasperating. They just won't try to understand our position, or to see the difference between a lot of stuff like this coming out in private and a downright public scandal. So this is a really important quote in terms of that contrast between illusion and reality, and what they care about in terms of their reputation. Birling is annoyed that, and I think there's a heavy irony here, they just won't try to understand our position. That's so ironic. I mean, the whole play is about the Birling's complete lack of understanding of the position of the working classes, the position that they constantly put people like Eva Smith in, the position where they have no choice, they have no voice, They haven't got, they can't campaign for higher wages. They can't speak out for their own rights. They have no rights as an unmarried mother who's pregnant. You know, they constantly fail to see the position of the people, like of the working classes, and yet here he is crying, you know, saying, "Oh, you just won't understand opposition," as if he's, you know, poor me. So there's a great irony in that, and the idea of that word position. But also what he's upset about is that they won't see the difference. He thinks it's different, the idea of public and private. He thinks, well, it's fine if we're horrible, exploitative liars and no one finds out about it, just as long as my reputation is intact. And so he still wants to live behind this facade. He still doesn't really care about the truth underneath, unlike the inspector's speech that we've just examined. You know, he would rather live behind a fake lie as long as he appeared well to his public. He doesn't really care what's going on and what the truth is behind it. He doesn't care who is hurt. And so it's a really horrible quote. It really presents him for who he really is and shows us that he's learnt absolutely nothing. And what's more, he's trying to prevent his children from learning anything as well, and from elevating themselves. What a guy. He's not as bad as he's not as bad as Weaselface, though. He's not as bad. No, he is. They're all as bad as each other. Somebody take over before I get upset.
I love how enraged you get over Birling and Gerald, especially Gerald.
They are enraging. Well, it's only because my students keep trying to convince me that Gerald is nice, just because they fancy him.
I was going to say it's just because they fancy him.
I don't know how. I don't get it. I'm sorry. I don't get it.
No.
I know I'm old and everything. I don't get it.
I oh gosh, yeah, I really don't get that, because he's gross. That's all I can say. I just think, you know, when we're just thinking about the line, they just won't try to understand our position, and it just sort of shows you how blind Mr. Birling is, because and like you said, the irony almost, because what about the working class people, and empathizing with them, and the fact that you've just been told during the evening that you were responsible for the death of somebody. It's just the lack of humanity there is what we've got here with Mr. Birling, and
the fact that he says try to understand as well. You just won't try to understand. What does he think the inspector's been trying to do for the whole night? He's tried to make them understand.
And the noun scandal as well, like he's thinking about how he will appear to all the other people in his social circle, whereas the scandal there, the notorious thing is actually a girl has died. So that's where I would be looking at it as an audience when he finishes with this. Miss Harris, have you got anything to add to
it? No, I think it's done a brilliant job as usual. I think something that a smaller word you could pick up on is the fact that he refers to the whole situation as stuff. It's very kind of him trying to detach himself from it and almost kind of devalue what the inspector's trying to, the messages that he's trying to get across. The fact, that you've said, the big scandal here is that a girl, a pregnant woman, has killed herself and her unborn child because of the horrors that she's been put through by this horrendous family, and he's referring to it as stuff.
That's brilliant.
Lack of respect and this lack of empathy that he has for Eva Smith's situation and kind of working class people generally, that he doesn't see any of their situations that they're put into or any of their business as important, of any value. Of it's not worth his time.
And even stuff like this as well. because it's almost like you know, this stuff happens all the time. It's almost as if, you know, behind closed doors, where think about Alderman Megarty again. You know, everyone had heard about him being a blouse ripper and a rapist, and it was like, oh yes, it's stuff like this. It's stuff that should happen in private, and as long as it's kept private, you know, stuff like this can be sorted out. You know, we can take care of this, we can handle it. So again, yeah, as well as kind of like downplaying it and sort of disregarding human life, it's almost kind of suggesting that it's an expected part of being part of the this kind of bourgeois world, that it's all kind of hushed up and brushed under the carpet, you know, stuff like this.
It's just sprang into my mind. This isn't too far, I mean, this is a bit extreme, but this isn't too far removed from, you know, what we've seen with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, is it, really? That he was in a quite privileged position, and then he used it to groom lots of girls, and then they tried to keep it all hush-hush because they used money to try and hide all the the misdemeanors is a euphemism, but, you know, all the sexual assaults they committed against young women. And you know, the people like Donald Trump are connected to him, and yet the media has been protecting Donald Trump. I've noticed a lot of articles where he's tried to disassociate himself from this particular man, and they've cut him out because he's got the money to exploit that and prevent himself from having a public scandal. And so, you know, unfortunately these things are still going on in contemporary society. So it might be, if you're someone that's aiming for a grade 9, to reflect on whether anything's changed since this play was written. Like how far we progressed is something that you could be critically thinking about to push yourselves up to those higher grades.
Could Donald Trump play Alderman Megarty?
He is the 21st century fat carcass.
He would make
Megarty.
an Alderman Megarty, couldn't he? Like with his toupee.
Yeah, and his very orange face. Anyway, guys, I'd like try to experiment with a bit of highlighting, so I don't know if it's going to help me move on to the next slide, but I'll try. Let's see. It might work. Oh, here we are. But I need to erase it all. So that's helpful. Hang on. Oh,
it's no time to get experimental in the last week.
I know. I just thought, well, I thought there's a lot of writing in the last one. I thought I'll just see if this works. Anyway, Miss Harrison, this is yours, isn't it?
Yes, this is mine.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So this is a quote that Sheila says. Kind of when things are starting to heat up between particularly the younger and older characters, where as Mrs. Marshall's already said, you know, Birling and Gerald and Mrs. Birling are feeling very pleased with themselves that they're kind of finding a bit of a loophole to get out of this scandal, as they call it. So Sheila says in response to that, I remember what he said, how he looked and what he made me feel, fire, blood and anguish, and it frightens me the way you talk, and I can't listen to it and to any more of it. So this is obviously in reference to the inspector, and obviously again we've got this kind of socialist message coming through. The inspector's words from his final speech are repeated within this dialogue from Sheila. We've obviously got the juxtaposition between what the younger characters are saying here and what the older characters have said, and how they're reacting to the fact that, is the inspector a fake, and is this situation potentially fake as well. So this is a good one if you get a question on something like remorse or redemption or change. This is a good one. You can look at how Sheila was in the beginning versus how she was at the end, and vice versa with the younger and older characters. So looking at particular phrases within the quotation, we've got the repetition of he within that first sentence, what he said, how he looked, what he made me feel. And this shows the impact that the inspector has had on Sheila, and the fact that she can't get him out of her head, and what he said to her has really stuck with her. So while the older Birlings are kind of discounting what he said, well, it doesn't matter anymore because, you know, he's a fake. You know, none of what he said is of any consequence, whereas Sheila thinks the exact opposite. So there's a nice juxtaposition there between the younger and older characters, and Birling and Sheila particularly. Like I've said, we've got the parallel syntax with the inspector's final speech and Sheila repeating his words. So again, it's kind of reiterating the fact that he's had a big impact on her, and it's also kind of potentially are they starting to adopt the socialist views? And again, the younger Sheila would kind of appeal to those younger audience members. And they would kind of potentially see themselves in her. Again, think of it as like a post-war audience where, you know, they were used to a lot more fluidity in society in terms of expectations of class and gender and things like that. So the fact that, you know, it's these socialist messages that are coming through, they would kind of appeal to the audience of 1945. This last sentence, it frightens me the way you talk and I can't listen to it anymore. Obviously we've got that kind of emotive verb, frightens, which again kind of harkens back to the emotive speech of the inspector. The fact that she's frightened, I think, is really important to look at. She's frightened by the way that her family and the man that she's supposed to be marrying is talking and reacting to the situation. And there's kind of a feeling of distance within the family now. You know, she's saying, it frightens me the way you talk, that pronoun you, it gives her a feeling of us and them. She's kind of wanting to distance herself and separate herself from these people who clearly haven't learned anything from what the inspectors said. I think that verb frightens as well could also reflect the anxieties at the time in the post-war audience. You know, the audience would be fresh out of, you know, the horrors of World War II, and the fact that, you know, the fire, blood and anguish does refer to the fact that, you know, if things don't change, then this is what could happen again. It could be, you know, more bloodshed unnecessarily. So I think the verb frighten has a dual meaning. She's saying, you know, it frightens her, the way that they are reacting to this new revelation, but it's also frightening to the audience that, you know, some of these characters clearly haven't learned anything. And the fact that she says, I can't listen to any more of it, that use of the contraction can't, I think is really important. And we can also look at the syntax of this quote. So think about as well how Sheila was in the beginning, particularly with her parents. You know, she was a character that kind of obeyed expectations, and you know, when Sheila's mother takes her out so the men can talk business, she does that. It's only when the inspector kind of comes in and interrogates her and she starts to adopt his way of thinking, that she turns on her family, just as Eric does. And again, as I said previously in the Eric video that we did, it was very unusual at the time in an Edwardian household, particularly in a middle upper class family, for children to disobey their parents, and for her to speak up against her parents and say that, you know, I'm not going to listen to what you say anymore. I'm not kind of buying into what you're saying, would have been very much a no-no in the Edwardian era. So again, it's kind of telling of how she's grown as a character, and how it's going to be people like her that can change with the times, adopt new ways of thinking that are going to drive society forward and progress to a more socialist society. Have you guys got anything to add to that?
I think
you've covered it.
Yeah. I think it's great. I like what you said at the beginning about the idea, you know, like she remembered what he said, how he looked, and what he made me feel as well. I think you've talked about how she starts to take on the inspector's ideas, but also how she kind of mirrors him in the stage directions and the adverbs as well. It talks about how she speaks passionately. And that bit at the beginning is almost like she's had an awakening. We talked in the last quote about how Priestley constructs it so that Birling is seen as blind. Like, you can't believe that he's saying this, you can't understand our position. But in contrast, if you wanted to look at change and the difference between whether the characters have learnt anything or not, then in contrast, Shakespeare, where's he come from? Sheila even Sheila's had this awakening, and it's quite interesting that she sort of appeals to the senses there. It's almost as though she's been come alive for the first time, and in standing up to her parents, like Miss Harrison said. The fact that it talks on, what she hears, what she feels, what she sees. She's awakened to this new feeling that she can't go back to. And like you said before, Priestley's relying on this kind of fear of, let's not return these old structures, they're dangerous. We need to move forward, and you need to be empowered like Sheila and awakened in your almost revolutionary kind of feeling, really, to kind of try and instill change.
I think that's really good, and I can't say anymore. I can only say that those comments you've just made will link sort of nicely to another quote that I've chosen, because we're looking at whether, if we link back to Ouspensky's theory, have any of these characters learned anything? And I think this is a bit of a test here, because you'll see what I mean in a moment when I put mine up. So it's a little conversation that Mrs. Marshall's favourite person has with Sheila. So, we know that Gerald spent his time trying to find ways to weasel out of this possible scandal, and because he wants to avoid any humiliation or embarrassment. So he is pretty pleased with himself, as are Mr. and Mrs. Birling, and he says to Sheila, everything's all right now, Sheila. I imagine he would say it in a much more posh accent than mine. I don't know if Mrs. Marshall wants to replicate how Gerald say that.
I don't know if I can do his smugness justice.
Okay. And he goes, what about this sprig? Again, I haven't got very good acting skills, so I imagine it would be said with much more intonation than I have given. And so I've chosen this because the stage direction is quite important. The fact that they've got the prop there. So if we cast our minds back to Act 1, and the whole reason why they've had this evening is because Gerald and Sheila are going to be united in marriage. They've got engaged. And she was loving the fact that he got the ring that she wanted, and that she was all set up to have a very successful life, or so she thought, with Gerald. Or her life would be very easy if she married up to the Gerald, who we know is part of the aristocracy. And so my hatred for Gerald, probably not as strong as Marshall, extends further, because he uses the I believe it's an adverb, everything's all right now. So when I use this term, I'm thinking, that makes me think, oh, everything's acceptable now, Sheila, right? And so because he's gone off and found out that the inspector wasn't real and that he's going to avoid any sort of embarrassment, that was his priority. Again, we've got similar things going on with like Mr. Birling. They're both pretty pleased and smug that no one's going to find out that he's had an affair, and Mr. Birling's going to avoid any public embarrassment. So the thing links back to what we said a couple of weeks ago about Priestley being really critical of the upper classes, because he despised the fact that they were able to behave in such immoral ways and get away with it because their money allowed them to exploit and hide such scandals. And so what we've got here is another example where Priestley's pretty scathing of it. And the ring itself then is quite symbolic, because this could go two ways for Sheila. She can either reject and dump Gerald now, which would be great, or she could carry on as normal. Now, if she's truly changed, the ring's going to be that symbol of a comfortable life. Okay, if she accepts it, if she doesn't accept it, then we know that whatever the inspector said to her that night has really held some weight with her. And this is what I like about Sheila, because she's not as forthcoming. You know, she's still got a way to go, which is what I think I said when we analysed Sheila, that we're not 100% sure if she's totally transformed, but there is a chance that she could. And so she says, no, not yet, it's too soon, I must think. So the adverb soon shows that she's still clearly impacted from the inspector's presence. Okay, but I think when we're trying to figure out if she might have changed, I'm going to make the assumption that it's probably going to go in the positive direction, because we know that Priestley wants to demonstrate that the younger generation are the hope that are going to push the changes forward that he wishes for society. So the I must think, it links back to what Miss Harrison said. She's actually not listening to Mr. and Mrs. Birling, who are just full of rubbish, really, and have such traditional views that don't align with change. So the modal verb must is much stronger. She's a much more stronger and independent thinker. And the fact that she uses the verb think shows that she's willing to assert herself, suggests that she's got her own opinions, shaped from her own knowledge, her own experiences, as opposed to the thoughts of Mr. and Mrs. Birling. The first person pronoun, I, suggests she's breaking away from Gerald and Birling's control as well. And I think that shows you that the authority the inspector has had over the evenings really hit home with Sheila. And this is why I think she could potentially change. However, I think these two sentences are just said before the phone call. And if we look at what we said earlier with the Spensky's theory, it's this idea that they're redesigned to live this cycle if they don't learn or spiritually improve. Now, we could argue Gerald, Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling probably haven't learned anything. So the phone call's quite significant. Does anybody want to extend the explanation, or shall I go on?
Do you think then that, because obviously with the theory it's to do with a cycle, do you think that the circular ring then is symbolic? He holds up the ring, so he's shown, obviously when he says everything's all right now, Sheila, he's shown that he's not going to break the cycle because he clearly hasn't learned. And then he holds up the ring to Sheila, like the cycle, and says, what are you going to do? It's kind of almost like putting it out there as if to say, like, are you going to change or not? Have you learned anything?
Oh, that's a really good point.
Is that going
no,
too
I
far?
really like that point. I kind of feel like that's why the cyclical structure is used then, isn't it? Because it's that contrasting.
Yeah.
Have they learned anything? Because, like I said, if she picks up that ring, she says, yeah, let's go get married, then they're going to end up sort of reliving this cycle. And I think this idea of Spensky's theory kind of is directed at the audience again, isn't it? Because they're going to leave the evening, aren't they? They've finished watching the play, and are they going to carry on moving forward?
I think I think it's vital that she doesn't give an answer, because I think the worry is that if he decides to go one way or the other and she gives an answer, then it becomes about the characters. And the whole point is that the play is a political piece. It's not about the characters, it's about the message. And so therefore he deliberately keeps it so that we never know whether she accepts or not, because then it's this idea that, you know, it could go either way, and it's much more powerful as a political piece that way, when you don't actually bring the plot into it. You know, will she, won't she, will they be getting back together or not? It's more this idea of what she's changed. And could it be, you know, when she says not yet, it's too soon, is that because it's 1912 and we're now in 1945? So no, it's too soon for me. Like, it's too soon in the sense that at 1912 she probably wouldn't have been in the position to be empowered to break away from those structures. And she probably would have had to accept and go back to him because she had no other choice. Whereas maybe it's like a little kind of like nod to the future. Yeah, you know, it's not the right time in 1912, but we're not in 1912 anymore. That's your parents' generation, that's gone. We're in 1945. Now is the time. Now is the time where you can break away from the structure and you can say, no, Gerald, no, I will not take your ring back. That's not me saying that.
That's the thing. Yeah, that's Sheila saying it. I think that's absolutely correct, because we know that the opportunities for women were pretty limited. I mean, I guess it's a scale of opportunities, because, you know, if we look at Eva Smith, she's got that sort of issue of being working class, so she's even more powerless. But Sheila's in a sort of situation of her own, isn't she, where she doesn't go down this route of marrying him, because they're not too far out off of, I know it's Edwardian times, but they're not too far off of Victorian expectations. And I do remember that if you were viewed as a woman that wasn't married, a spinster, so to speak, it wasn't really something that was seen, you know, you weren't seen as a strong, independent woman. You were seen as a bit of an outsider, a bit of an outlier. And I think that, and that's really a good point to make about the fact that she's not stupid, Sheila, now. She has to be, you know, she has to have that self-preservation as well. So, that's
it's
really
all right
good.
Now you can get cats now, and it's all right if you've got
you can
cats,
get cats, did you say?
Yeah, if you're a spinster and you've got cats, then it's all right now, really, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. I feel like, or a dog. I like dogs better, I think.
The stereotype cats, but yeah, dogs are way better.
Oh yeah, the stereotype. I'm just trying to change the stereotype. It's like, my personal preference are dogs. Anyway, has anybody got anything to end with? Because I feel like that's all I can say with my quote. Oh
no, I think.
Oh yeah, the phone ringing. I mean.
Oh yeah. Yes. So yeah, straight after your quote, the phone rings, doesn't it? And obviously, it leaves you with the unanswered question of is it going to repeat itself in exactly the same way or not? And again, that's very deliberately ambiguous, isn't it? He doesn't want to tell you whether it all repeats itself. You've got to go out of the theatre kind of thinking about it. And again, I think that's really deliberate, that he doesn't want to give you the answer. He wants you to contemplate whether the cycle repeats or not.
And I feel like we haven't really touched upon this, but the fact that they've all seen potentially a different photo, because two people haven't seen the same photo. If this is a different woman each time, then actually I think that's quite significant, because what we've seen is actually they're willing to exploit any working class person. And so if they haven't learned the lesson, it puts other working class people in a really dangerous position. So you'd be, like I said, leaving the theatre and thinking, I really don't want things to go back to how they were in 1912, because we've clearly just seen what happens when there's such rigid class structures. So I think that's what I'd be going with. I'd be like trying to like sign a petition or something at the end of it. Taking some action.
They should have a green person that decides they should have like the little political petition, join the Labour Party on the way out.
He's like signing a change online petition or something.
Definitely. And in the Art of Drama book, it talks about the structure with the almost obviously you have the doorbell at the start with the inspector coming and shutting up Mr. Birling when he's talking about community and all that nonsense. But then it talks about the idea that it's almost like the three bells tolling, because you get like the Gerald return. So the Gerald's return is like their chance that they get to put things right. And to break out of the cycle, because he comes back with this new news, oh, actually the inspector's the fake. So that's like the second bell tolling, and then the final bell of the phone call that happens just after this quote is like almost like the knelling death bell of Eva Smith, almost as though it's kind of like you had your chance to change and now you haven't, and so therefore the final bell is almost like you had your chance and you haven't taken it, in a way which I thought was quite interesting interpretation.
Yeah, can you imagine if you were Edna and you were watching all this unfold? I bet Edna would have a real good evening shift just watching all of this coming out and feeling pretty...
fly on the wall.
Yeah, to be a fly on the wall, and Edna's right there. And I think
that's going to be enough series from these online lessons. I think next, if we have a second wave and we have to go into lockdown again, it's going to be Edna's spin-off, Fly on the Wall.
Edna's spin-off. I feel like out of everybody, I think Edna's my favourite.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, unassuming, does her job well, polite to people like Mr. Birling, even though she shouldn't have to be. I mean, I know he does pay her bills, but I just feel like she's a good one, Edna, and no one gives her enough credit.
She is. Didn't Miss Morose come as Edna for World Book Day once?
Yeah, she did come as well. She did come as Edna.
She really championed Edna. I like that.
She should have opened all the doors.
She should have. Please, sir.
Right. Have we got any final words for people before we go?
Can I just add to the phone call?
Yes, Miss Harrison, please do.
Sorry. So I think what's really interesting here is that the phone rings and someone's coming from the police because a woman's killed herself. The police wouldn't actually know that unless the Birlings and Gerald weren't so arrogant to believe that they could worm the way out of it and get away with it. If they hadn't rung and said, has a girl killed herself by ingesting disinfectant, no one would have known that if they hadn't been so bloody arrogant. And now they've just incriminated themselves. So it's this, it kind of relates back to this idea of selfish, arrogant, capitalist behaviour is dangerous. It's gonna lead people, get people into trouble and kind of fortune on not just the working class but those types of people as well.
That's a really good point. The sad thing is though, I think are these guys protected? Because we go all the way back to the beginning where he boasts about these people that he knows. And I feel like these guys have people in high places that could probably protect them.
Yeah. How do we know Colonel Roberts? Colonel Roberts could just
Colonel Roberts is
the heads up guys,
Yeah, and people on the bench and I don't know. I could just all imagine them just going for gentlemen's drinks and sort of a bit of money, passed underneath the table. And I mean, this is just an extension. This is not actually what happens in the place. I don't mention that. That's just my theory.
Another spin-off.
Yeah, another spin-off. So don't mention that.
But seriously, this is what he wants us to be doing, isn't it? And this is why the ending is deliberately ambiguous, because he wants us to be having these exact conversations about could maybe this happen to, maybe history will just repeat itself. Oh no, maybe maybe it will come back to bite them on the bum. So these conversations that we're having, it's exactly his intention as an author that we're having these, because if those conversations are taking place, it means he's done his job in terms of it being a socialist agenda.
Yeah, brilliant. I've got nothing more to say, guys.
No, me neither.
Except I wish everybody a good summer, because
Yeah,
I think we all need it, don't we? After
definitely.
Yeah, so hopefully everyone's found these really useful. And please use them and stop and pause and make lots of notes, and make sure that you keep all these notes for when we come back as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.